is, why are so many people getting dropped from their insurance carriers, right? I mean, we have on Facebook these community pages, and it seems like every day I see someone posting, oh my gosh, I just got dropped, or I got a notice. What do I do? Who do you guys recommend that I call? Now, the first thing is, I believe, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong on this, there's legislation that was enacted that if somebody is to, or a carrier is not going to renew that homeowner, they have at least 45 days to go find a replacement carrier. Is that correct? So it doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but there's like this defined time frame. Did I hear that right?
Yes, so usually your policy renewal will have a very clear start and end time. And in 99% of the cases, you're going to see that renewal notice or notice of non-renewal come out prior to that time. So there should be ample time prior to that. I always encourage people to make sure you're checking that mail. Because they're like, I don't ever check my mail. I didn't see it. And we get calls all the time. Like, I just happened to look at it and my policy's canceling tomorrow. Why folks are getting dropped from their carriers, a lot of it has to do with those things that I kind of mentioned in the first part. Many carriers had to make a tough financial business decision to either leave the entire area to reduce their risk of a wildfire prone area. And so it comes from a sustainability perspective. So they need to be able to stay in business and be there for folks who they are continuing to insure and to pay out those claims. And so sometimes it comes at that cost of folks being dropped. State Farm has not had any mass non-renewals or mass cancellations for anything other than folks who are kind of outside the norm of claims. So, if the average claims history, is maybe once every 17 to 20 years, if somebody's fallen 3 in 3 years, they can be seen as maybe not the most attractive risk for a company. But each company is kind of having a variety of reasons why, many of them being driven by coming from a purely financial perspective and trying to remain solvent. It's hard because people take it very personally. And I try to tell people, it's like, we love you. We love taking care of you. It's not a personal thing. But it's just coming from, a corporate decision. As people are maybe experiencing that, again, utilizing your existing agent to say, who can you connect me to that might be an option that I can talk to? You kind of know my house, you know the situation. Are there other carriers that you think I might be attractive to in that instance? But it's hard. It's hard. And it makes us sad too when we can't help our neighbors, and either when they're not eligible on the front end or for a variety of reasons if we hear that they're being dropped. So
the other part that plays in that a little bit is also the reinsurance. So the reinsurance is going to essentially kind of come back to farmers or State Farm and say, hey, like, we only want a certain percent of this risk in the wild, a certain percent of your business in Colorado in a wildfire risk. So that's kind of driven it a little bit too, on top of just the overall risk management for the company to be successful and to be profitable.
Now, Dusty used a word, which is reinsurance. So I'm not sure if everybody understands what that is. So the reinsurance, they're like the insurance companies for the insurance companies, right? Tell us a little bit more about how that works, Dusty.
So it essentially, I think Jen spoke about it a little bit earlier. It's insurance that insurance companies take out to help cover losses and stuff like that. And they do drive a lot in regards to what they are willing to take on. And so where the wildfire risk here in Colorado is one of the bigger risks, they can, go back to farmers or State Farm and say, we don't want to see, this percentage of your homes in this area and stuff like that. So they kind of dictate also what they're willing to take on or to insure if a claim or a massive loss ever happens in Colorado.
Got it. So if someone gets dropped, they get that notice in the mail. I mean, besides calling their agent, what else should they do? What should someone do if they are dropped? Is there a chance potentially they could, make some adjustments and stay, or do you typically see that people have to move elsewhere? Not their house, but to a different carrier.
a lot of it kind of depends on the reasoning. Say, for example, there was maybe you've had your policy in place for 5 years and they have gone out in the last year in anticipation of your renewal to do a re-inspection. Maybe they find that you have barrels of gasoline up against the house and piles of wood and, you know, all sorts of stuff that you've not kept up with your mitigation efforts. And so maybe they sent out a letter and said, hey, you need to do all these mitigation things, and you opted to not do them. So in that respect, there are some opportunities for remediation. If you resolve those issues, they would likely consider consider renewing the policy if you met that criteria. If you're being dropped for, you know, a reason like excessive claims, I know we have the option sometimes to ask for an appeal for things along those lines. But usually if it is a wide scale event, like some of the carriers have opted to leave altogether, that pretty much is a final decision, because, you know, that carrier is no longer going to be servicing or providing policies to anyone in the area. First step would be start with your current agent and just say, hey, you know, do you have any resources? Can you help connect me to colleagues that you have in the area that might be able to help? We're always happy to do that. I think later we'll talk a little bit about the FAIR plan that's kind of coming in January. And so that may be offering some relief to folks potentially as we get into 2025. But, you know, sometimes your neighbors and your friends are also that great resource too, to say, who are you insured with? And, you know, who have you been able to get coverage through?
So we had a question here. I think it's kind of relevant. So Tim asks, are rate increases of 27% last year and 57% this year typical of what you're seeing across the board? Or is this an indication your carrier is preparing to drop you? Like, are they just putting the pressure on to the point where your wallet can't handle it anymore, and they're kind of scooting you out the door on the side? I mean, is that a practice that you think is happening, or is it just this, you know, environment, the reinsurance, you know, industry that's putting all the pressure on these rates?
Essentially, your policy is being re-rated for its risk. Conifer Evergreen is #1 in Colorado for fire risk. So essentially you are seeing a higher increase. I'm seeing those increases on all my renewals of all the policies in my agency. It's because they are reassessing the risk of it happening. And also a little bit of it is the cost to rebuild. So most likely your dwelling amount went up with that rate increase. But yes, most of it is just the insurance companies adjusting their rates to meet the risk.
Now, I built my house 7 years ago, and I know I couldn't do it again today for the price that we paid. What are you seeing in terms of the cost per square foot for the rebuild? I mean, I've heard a couple numbers out there, but I want to hear from you too. What your average is when you're calculating that?
That's a great question. I will kind of go back to Dusty's piece. When folks call us about a rate increase, they are taking it personal and thinking we're personally attacking them. And unfortunately, I don't think that companies are doing that to drive people out. I would concur with Dusty that it's more so working to better assign rate and premium to the risk and the exposure up here. It's hard though. I mean, we recognize that folks all work within a family budget. And so when things are going up in their whole entire world, it's difficult. And so while we're able to still say you're covered, it does come with a cost increase, and it's hard. It's hard because we recognize and we have such empathy for that situation. Those are those opportunities to talk with your agent and say, you know, is there an opportunity to adjust my deductibles? Maybe I'm more willing to take on a higher deductible in the event of a loss and have lower premiums over time. But those are things that you can proactively do to kind of talk to your agent about how can we best adjust that. To go to your second question, the Marshall Fire really did a good job at providing some markers for the first time. So you had a very large scale event. And so the Denver Builders Association, I think it was, put out some numbers that you can look up via newspaper articles, kind of of information coming out of there. And so they gave some price ranges from, you know, average homes, custom homes to designer homes. And so we kind of have those marks. We also know that new construction up here there, which is very few and far between. There's not a ton of new construction going on in the area. You know, folks that are getting insurance at that point, we're able to kind of hear from them about, you know, what was your price per square foot? The majority of those are on the higher end, very, lots of square footage in those homes, high-end finishes. And so those are on the high end. We use a tool called an estimated cost replacement tool, kind of as our first point. And so that's where either at the initial point of when you took out the policy, all the characteristics and the features and the finishes and the square footage and, you know, is your basement finished? Is it not? All of those things are aggregated together to come up with an estimated replacement cost that is somewhat narrow for our specific area. So that's always a good first point. I imagine that most insurance companies utilize something like that. And so, you know, also things change over time. We saw kind of coming out of COVID, lumber prices skyrocket. And so, you know, you have vacillations with the market. And so that's why having those conversations with your agent to kind of keep a pulse on what is the market doing right now? What does my pool say? Kind of what's the going rate for prices around our area for, you know, a cookie cutter home versus a high-end home.
Sure. Now, one last question as we talk about the pricing and, you know, maintaining your insurance, and then we'll move on. Stephanie asks, is there a cap on how much a premium can increase for a homeowner?
No. There's not. Unfortunately, there's not. I mean, I wish I had a better answer to it, but there's not. I mean, I've had a policy that went up 200% last year. So there really isn't a cap. And to go back to the rebuild cost, we essentially have the same system also. Our system is updated on a monthly basis, and how it's updated is we call per zip code. We call anywhere from 5 to 10 builders in that zip code, and we get the current cost that they're charging per square footage to rebuild. And then that's averaged out. So when we put your information in, it's done by your zip code. So they obviously know that our zip code, it would be totally different than like a zip code down the hill for that cost per square footage.
Sure.
Well,
Well,
I'll jump in and say, one of the things that we find that I think agents who are located here in the mountains bring benefit is we are mindful for the unique nuances that homes in our area have. Just like Dusty was mentioning, a house up here rebuilt is very different from a house down in Denver. And so most of them don't have wells, most of them don't have septic, you know, all those kinds of things. And so having somebody here who is keenly aware of those differences that can kind of be present, I think can be an absolute benefit when looking at, you know, differences in rebuild costs.
yeah. Well, and, you know, I can speak from experience that, you know, when you go out, if you're working with a mountain realtor, they will give you some guidance on, hey, this house is a little bit farther from the fire department. It might be a challenge to get insurance, or, you know, there's not a water source nearby because all the homes are on wells in the neighborhood. There's no hydrants. That can take a little bit longer for them to bring you water in the event of emergency. So working with someone that kind of knows the area and what those challenges are and guide you in the right direction is really important.